Okay, then I start right away. I need to look at the time, and sorry if it takes a bit more. It might take a bit more than with like 5 minutes more maybe, but I'll try to stop in due time. Okay, so first a short introduction. As I said, when we previously introduced ourselves informally, that this research is actually a product of two larger projects. One was 1989 after 1989, led by Professor James Mark, and another one called Socialism Goes Global, both connected to James Mark and the University of Exeter. I worked as a research assistant, and we started to focus on how Eastern Europe relates to colonialism, anti-colonialism, and the history of decolonization. And my case study is and was Hungary. And so far, I've also worked, co-curated with SS Szakács, an art and documentary exhibition called The Transperiphery Movement, Global Eastern Europe and Global South, which was featured in Budapest and Kiev as part of the Off Biennale. Also, I'd like to draw your attention to the Decolonizing Eastern Europe group, which I founded, which now has 3,000 members on Facebook. It's a closed group, so you have to apply, and it's also on Twitter. Now, my focus has been, as I said, on how to understand Eastern Europe, and specifically Hungary, in the global histories of colonialism. And I'm really interested, particularly interested in the relations between Eastern Europe and the post-colonial global South, or the third world, whichever geographical category you use. And my title is Colonia Hungaria, which for me is a semi-fictitious imaginary, partly a fantasy of a Hungarian colonial world, an acumen. I would like to talk about the geographical and historical complexities of coloniality in the Hungarian context, the several narrative layers, and the competing groups who try to imagine this Colonia Hungaria. And I stick to not the Spanish or Portuguese term as it was used. So, for example, Colonia Hungara, which will come up in my materials, because this was imagined in several parts of the world, in North America, Africa, and other parts of Asia too. And so the question in my case is also of agency, representation, and I would say the politics of history, information politics, because mostly we build on information which is provided to us, in the case of the history of colonialism, provided to us from elites and intellectual projections of coloniality. And we seldom look at the populations involved in the wider project of colonialism. What I'd like to do is not go into a detailed in-depth case study, but building on the previous speakers, also Monica Sente Varga and others, and their research, provide an overview of the various positions in this Colonia Hungaria in the context of Latin America from the perspective of Hungarian colonists. But before we do that, I just like to draw your attention to the context, and I return to the present in the end. The current political discourse, how it has been since 2012, increasingly turned into a colonial discourse, which has been used and abused by the government, but also mirrored by the opposition parties. This is largely based on fears of being colonized by Western globalists, by Brussels, the European Union, by Russia, or recently China. It's based on national victimization, which is actually competing globally, which people seldom look at in this global context. You can read a short piece on the Berliner Gazette, co-written by me and Kasia Narkowicz, the Hungarian and Polish case. Why this is important is because this is connected to the other part of this discourse, that we never had colonies. So this division, which is constructed politically and supported by the government in Hungarian geopolitics and foreign policy, is that we never had colonies, not the colonizers. So this division between the colonizer and non-colonizer countries, which is in the forefront of European Union politics debates, is also a part of post-socialist memory politics. because this argument has been used for not just the socialist period, but even beyond in the interwar era, and before that in the 19th century in Hungary, as a colonial apologetics. And usually decolonization and racism has been in Hungarian history presented as an import of the West. So we do not have race, we don't have colonialism, it's a discourse and it's a history connected to the West. So this is actually in Hungary connected to or understood by a false conception of a territorial understanding of global colonialism. So who had colonies and who hadn't. And in turn, we should look at the spatial modes of integration into global colonialism. And this is why a world systemic approach is important. So looking at the ways how Hungary integrated into global colonialism from a peripheral and a semi-peripheral position, and how this semi-peripheral position, especially throughout the 19th and 20th and now 21st centuries, shows this position of being in between, being the colonizer and the colonized, being white and not quite white, being racializing and racialized, and showing this colonial restlessness of gaining colonies, of not becoming colonies, and also this frustrated whiteness of being in this in-between position, of trying to catch up to being white and being a colonial European, right? And also some features of escapism, of looking at the colonies as a form of national revitalization and like a political imaginary of the colonial world as something that would offer opportunities for the Hungarian nation. But what is this? And this is why I'll talk about this semi-peripheral coloniality, which is my terminology, which I try to develop. So what is the special role of Eastern Europe? Usually they talk about the missing Eastern Europe in the global histories of colonialism, but is this not just injecting our histories into post-colonial studies? And this is a problem because I use my research to question the dominant mainstream British and Anglo-Saxon and often Anglophone narratives and concepts of global colonialism, also reflected in post-colonial studies, but not to import West-developed concepts of race and colonialism between West and the global South and this Commonwealth geography, and not simply use us as a case study of Orientalism or a version of colonialism or white supremacy, but contesting the Anglo-American knowledge hegemony and imperialism in the form of an epistemic decolonization, but not on nativist revanchism. If we look into our colonial histories, we find this nativist revanchism in these many of these nationalist arguments, but towards a global historical understanding to meticulously look at the specific ways these structural relations condition Hungarian positions, articulations, and forms of colonialism and race. And this is where I'll try to expand on and develop this concept of transcoloniality. How different and differently understood colonial contexts are entangled, intertwined globally, how they can only be traced and understood in a global and trans-regional or transnational approach. And trans also means here cutting across borders, boundaries, also reconnecting, and also transforming accepted conceptions. And this is something that we try to develop in the Trans-Periphery Movement exhibition, which I referred to. So this goes against the static typologies and concepts of internal, external colonialism, maritime or land-based colonialism, formal or informal colonialism, imperialism, and also the relationist and constructivist concepts of Orientalism. See, for example, the applied version of nested Orientalism, or I would like to refer to Balázs Ablóczi's research and book. The English version just came out of his book on Tyrannism. I would contradict his arguments regarding Tyrannism as a part or a version of Orientalism, Hungarian Orientalism. Indeed, I will argue that it's a part of this semi-peripheral trajectory, colonial trajectory of Hungarians, and it's also connected to this in-between racial identification. So this will also raise questions of trans-peripheral agency, which I mentioned. It's mostly imagined by elites and intellectuals, and we do not look into other marginal histories colonialism from the margins. And this Latin American context will, I try to use this context to focus on this. So I think that this will allow us to deconstruct the colonizer-colonized dichotomy, which has been, as I tried to show, mobilized by political discourse, by political elites in nationalist, conservative victimization discourses. So what are the historical layers of Hungarian colonialism? So before we turn to Latin America, I try to show this trace which will lead us to the Latin American context, which goes way back, settling the new homeland of Hungarians in the 9th century AD. This nomadic heritage of settling, the nomadic people settling in and coming from Asia, but becoming European, is part of our narratives of nationhood and national identity. Why this is important is that later on, after the Ottoman occupation, which is usually referred to as a sort of colonization, and there's little actual intellectual debate on whether that could be a form of colonization in Hungary. So in the post-Ottoman period, there was this reconquista, this resettling of the land of the Hungarian kingdom, which involved various peoples. So this colonial space of the Hungarian kingdom, I try to show on this map on the left, these colonial settlements, was a multi-ethnic space, which then becomes a subject to various overlapping colonial projects. And what is often ignored is the connections with other colonization projects, for example, the parallels and circulation of ideas and technologies of colonialism. For example, late 18th century connections to North American West and also Russian Eastern expansion. But what's also very important in this case is the effect of German hegemony. So many of these colonists were Germans, and they maintained their ethnic identities due to the long-lasting German hegemony during the Habsburg period. Now, another layer is the Orientalism. So the 19th century process of imagining the Alfeld Basin, this huge wasteland and also basin area, as a national space, as it was canonized later on in the 19th century, first was imagined as a colonial space, borrowing and transferring ideas of Western colonial aesthetics of the Orient, and also perceptions of Hungary by travelers, to framing the Hungarian landscape by Hungarian painters who studied in Germany, for example, and other parts of the West, where they learned this aesthetic. So many elements and figures of the Alfeld became a national canon. For example, the horse riding Csikós or the Betyár, and this nomadic identity connected to the Alfeld Basin as a colonial national landscape. But it was also contrasted to the highlands, which was mostly common in Germanic peoples or Germanic folklore. So the highlands was where some of the white race was bred in that environment, and it also became a romanticized landscape of various national identities. But in Hungary, this identity was this basin culture, the Hungarian Mesopotamia, as the geographer Gyula Prince wrote. So which bred this superior Hungarian nation, which was contrasted, for example, to other peripheral marginal areas, for example, the Balkans. So this was a part of this colonial trajectory against the Balkans, but it also included this restlessness of the wasteland and these semi-peripheral imperial fantasies and compensation for not having a sea and the maritime culture, which is in our poetry and our literature, the tengersík puszta, the sea flat wasteland, as providing freedom, as written by Sándor Petőfi, the famous poet, and also served as an arena to divert colonial emigration. So Hungarian colonists who fled to Americas towards the untamed landscape of the Balkans. So it was part of the migration discourse. And this landscape was, as I said, connected to this nomadism and this tyrannism, and this in-between racial identity of Hungarians being Asian, but also European, being not quite white. So I understand this as a form of compensation or semi-peripheral colonial compensation for, as I said, not having a maritime culture, but also providing this mobility which Hungary could not get, in contrast to the Western imperial powers. This is an example of the Chaco rider. And I'm talking about these aesthetics also because these will return in the context of Hungarian colonists settling in Latin America in various ways. Now, again, another historical turn, which will now lead us to the Latin American context, is that, as I said, this multi-ethnic, populated, colonized area of the Hungarian kingdom throughout the 18th century and 19th century was connected to German colonists settling in the region. It's called the Great Swabian Trek because mostly these were Southern German, Swabian Germans who still have some sort of identity in this former region of the Hungarian kingdom and also now in Hungary. These are some of the areas in red where they settled in the Bachka and Banat mountainous regions, but also the Danubian mountains, which will be important in our case. And also the Alford region. Now, why this is important is that these Swabian Germans became subjects of German colonial trajectories throughout the 20th century, and this culminated in the Second World War and the colonization plans of Eastern Europe by the Nazis. So in the interwar era, there was also a return to the countryside movement due to these were reactions to the Trianon Treaty, how to revitalize the nation, how to rebuild the nation from our roots. And they also became important in these imaginaries to connect the Hungarian race to the Hungarian landscape. So the folk writers, village researchers, and various racial politicians tried to protect the Hungarian race against German influence. There were questions of assimilation and how to keep Hungarian populations. And Germans mapped the areas where the German Hungarian populations lived, as you can see in these maps. And as you know from history, as an effect of the Second World War, there were resettlement schemes. So they were resettled from this area back to Germany. Okay, now why this is important is because also in the interwar era, many of these Swabian Germans emigrated to Latin America, specifically to southern Brazil, but also to Argentina and mostly these southern regions. So Paraguay, Uruguay, southern Brazil, and Argentina. Now, why this is important is because there was a vast emigration of Hungarians to the USA. More than around 1.5 million Hungarians flocked to the USA in 3 decades. And due to the USA Quota Act between 1921 and 24, the very racial immigration policies against Eastern European new migrants, these were kept back, and either they tried to reach USA through Cuba and Mexico, as we talked about this in the previous session, or they went later on to Latin America, to Southern America, to settle there. Okay. And I return to this context of the Swabian Germans because their story is, what I try to show with the concept of transcoloniality is that they became subjects of the Brazilian racial state. First, they tried to lure immigrants to populate the colonial frontiers, and then they became subject of assimilation politics, but also, as I tried to show, of German colonial trajectories, and also of Hungarians who tried to organize the diaspora to keep the Hungarians, either to bring them back to Hungary or to organize them there as colonists. So some of these images of these Hungarian colonies, which were populated by mostly only Hungarians. So there were some ethnic colonies like Colony Arpad or Colony Bethlen. And you can see on this map on the right is from an advertisement of the Transocean shipping company, the route of Hungarians after Trianon Treaty after 1920. And this period, it is estimated that around 80% of the Hungarian immigrants going to Latin America came from the detached territories. So those people were fleeing due to the consequences of and effects of the Trianon Treaty, like as I referred to, there were these mostly far-right and strongly racist arguments of preserving the nation and bringing back the colonial Hungarians. And in my project is to map these colonies in order to provide geographical overview of these colonies. What's really interesting is that these experiences sunk deep into colonial folklore. This is an example of a rural folk song, which was transformed into a so-called Americas song. So the same frame, but then the content was changed to South America. So traveling to South America. The similar structure was in cases of traveling to North America. It was actually on the image which I put in is from a book from Miklos Szabó, which was published in 1982, which shows how it's in our folk tales also, and some images, some figures like the Szekler, the Székely traveler, which is in our folk tales, also shows this actually vast global migration and remittance networks of Hungarians, where the Székely or the Szeklers were very active. And also the America or emigration crosses erected in Hungary, in the places from where these people came from. These were erected to thank their home settlements, but they also show how these remittances affected their social mobility and bourgeoisification locally. We have to remember that in the Austro-Hungarian monarchy and also later on in Hungary, the country really depended on remittances. So the whole stability of the economy depended on these remittance networks. So some examples, some photos of building the colonies. My question is, are they colonists? So these peripheral agents of colonization, the poor who fled to the colonial frontiers, to clear the rainforest and build farmland, were controlled by structural relations, capitalists, and various colonial and racial states. So again, another picture and also advertisement of coming to Hungarians writing to Hungarian immigrants to come to specific Hungarian colonies, Árpád-falva and Boldogasszony-falva, for example, shows these colonial ethnic communities as a form of geographical navigation and building these information networks in order so they could form these colonial community, ethnic communities of Hungarians. But it also shows these discourses of climatization. So finding climate and this landscape fit for whites, and comparisons with Hungarian well-known land and landscapes were important in these information networks. You can see some of these parcels of lands in the case of Jaraga do Sul, which I show. So let's look at some of the actors who were involved in these colonial Hungarian imaginaries. And one important person who is Ferenc Kordas, who was a folk writer, village researcher, and also Julian a teacher. Julian School Association was founded in 1904 in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Croatia, Slavonia, in the context of scattered settlements and in the Northern Balkans, but later developed into a larger school network. So Ferenc Kordas connected this village researcher, folk writer tradition when he came to a teacher in Sao Paulo, and he wrote sociographies on the Hungarian colonies. For example, Chango Hungarians from Bukovina who founded Boldogasszony-falva in one example. He also wrote poems, and he has various travel diaries and other manuscripts, which I'm digitizing at Déri Museum in Debrecen in Hungary. So what's important in the case of Ferenc Kordas is he looks at these poor workers and farmers, and there's this ambivalence and antagonism in his sociographies. On the one hand, he praised and aestheticized the heroic colonial figure of the Hungarian colonists, an aesthetic driven by the centuries-old Hungarian drive of occupying their land. This was a quote. And returning to the this aesthetic of the roots of the Hungarian tree, which will stick to and transform the land, a discourse of national survival and revitalization. So the colonies will bring revitalization of the Hungarians if they maintain their national identities. He also writes about Hungarians bringing crops from home. So this colonial battle of maintaining your identity with bringing Hungarianness to the colonies and preserving your identity that way is also important in this discourse. But on the other hand, these colonists were trapped. They were craving to go back home. There was also fear of assimilation, and they were low-class, uneducated populations. So Ferenc Kordás's ideas to organize this diaspora was futile. Another example of this, where, as I said, it was mentioned, Iterare was one example, which was called Colonia Hungara. So this 1,000-year mystical Hungarian force works well even in the distant overseas. The forcefully replanted Hungarian tree wants to grow as Hungarian. It ripens Hungarian flowers and crops, even with difficulty, but it does. Connected to Ferenc Kordás's discourse too. Now, a few more examples. The Catholic colonial alternative of Jesuit missionaries Béla Banga and his priest compatriot Zoltán Nyisztor positioned this post-Trianon Hungary in this global colonial vision connected to post-colonial Latin America. So they were important leaders of the Catholic revitalization movement, and they pursued this militant Catholicism, which was staunchly racist, anti-Bolshevik, and it had anti-Semitic motives. For example, Nyisztor became a proponent of the pro-Nazi Nyilas movement later on during the war, and fled to emigration after the war. Now, in his South American travelogue, Under the Southern Cross in 1934, Banga fantasized about open and spiritually fertile colonial spaces in Latin America, positioning the Hungarian Jesuit heritage of Indian reductions in the 17th century as ideal foundations for national revitalization, racial brotherhood with the Indians, and also missionary expansion. Based on his travel experiences among native Indians in North America, this was contrasted with the colonial imperialist and racially perilous Protestant mode of a so-called spiritless North American or Western modern capitalism. So Banga imagined a Catholic, colonial, and the semi-peripheral alternative, seeking to counter this dominant Atlantic Protestant narrative of global colonial history, and channeling these Hungarian ambitions into resisting these forces by emancipating the silenced Southern Catholic colonial history. And Banga and Nyisztor also reinforced paternalist racial images of decadent Indian race, which could only be saved by the white influx of racial mixing and Catholic civilizing. If supported by a solidary and organized colonial Hungarian diaspora through missionary activity. So this was from the position of the church and the Catholic religious movements. But what's interesting is that here you could see them arriving in South America. In Nyisztor's case, for example, who also wrote a travelogue, Skyscrapers, Rainforests, and the Homeless in 1935, he connected the Hungarian Puszta with the South American Pampa. So this South American wasteland to build a vision of an agrarian utopia, as he wrote in this newspaper article on the right, the Canaan of the Pampas for the Hungarians. This was also connected to various articles and missionary pulp novels in the interwar era, which were very famous. So this was embedded in the wider discourse. Now, lastly, just two more examples. I won't really delve into this, but I mentioned because of lack of time, but I mentioned the trope of colonial escapism, which is there throughout Hungarian history. So whatever political crisis, in this case, the 1948ers who fought against the Habsburg for Hungarian independence, fled Hungary and tried to establish Hungarian Republic by gaining colonies or by allying with rival imperial powers. It's there, this discourse of founding a colony where you could start all over. But you could also find these traces in the 16th century for example, in the famous Hungarian poet Miklós Zrínyi. And in this case, this is also related to Jewish Zionism and finding a Jewish homeland. I wanted to put in this example, which you could watch, Nova Lithuania, which is about a semi-fictitious story. This is a film of the semi-fictitious story of evacuating Lithuania in 1938 because fears of colonial invasion by German Nazis, Soviet Union, and also Poland. Finding the colonies as an isolated space for escaping the vicissitudes of homogenizing nationalist, racialist politics in the homeland. This is connected to some other positions in the post-1920, post-Trianon, interwar era imaginary, the declassed aristocrats, the gentry. One example is György Dadányi, who found moral refuge in the Chaco region in Paraguay, where he became a cattle herder or a gaucho. So this declassed position found moral refuge in two things, both the allies, the indigenous as allies who are morally superior, which is very similar to the discourses of the Indian play in the interwar era. And the second was retaining this noble position through the horsemanship and the position of being a gaucho in this peripheral colonial context. And there were also aristocrats who tried to organize Hungarian colonies through the power of capital. One example is Archduke Habsburg Teschen Albert. I won't go into details because I have to finish, but the last example is Miklós Horthy Jr., the son of Governor Miklós Horthy, who became a prominent diplomat, ambassador at the Embassy of Hungary in Brazil in 1939. So this now connects back to the German Swabian, the Swabian Hungarian context, because the World War II ended in the restriction of both German and Hungarian language, and also the assimilation politics of the Brazilian racial state. Brazil declared war on Axis powers on the 22nd of August in 1942. So what happened is that these colonial desires to organize this diaspora were not successful. So what I want to end with is that in this post-socialist era, the government, Orban governments have been very active in returning to this diaspora through TV shows, new consuls, organization scholarships, and also repatriation programs. So what I'd like to end with is that ironically, these very nationalist narratives of returning to these post-colonial spaces offer options and alternatives of creolizing our Hungarian national histories, because these people are not, some even do not speak Hungarian by now. So in Hungarian discourse, where the migrant has been racialized as something that's non-white, these people, the government has been strongly trying to frame them as non-migrants. They are actually Hungarians. So you could see this uneasy return to our colonial histories in this case, and the actual conservative nationalist politics of the Hungarian government. So thank you very much, and sorry about the time.